everyone. Welcome to Offsite Dirt, our newest area, cross sections with Anthony Gude. He is an investor. He also uses Offsite in his solutions and his developments. Welcome, Anthony. How are you?
Audrey, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
I love that you're here. You know that this is the world that we are living in, and it's great to see your experience. And I'm so glad that you are joining the Offsite construction team. It makes me happy that you have this experience and you see things from a different perspective. So let's jump into how can the industry come together to originate more projects that bring investors and the financial performance benefits of Offsite.
Thank you for asking. So I think there's a number of elements, and I'll break it down as best I can the time we have. But ultimately, we have come to a place where I think as an industry, there's a certain amount of steady growth, and that's wonderful. And more ownership buying into and using better processes to deliver on projects is essential. So there's my opinion is that there's both a opportunity to represent the delivery method in the terms that investors and non-industry professionals understand, which ultimately is what we end up doing every day when we try to onboard new backers. And the second element is that we also have a captive audience of investors that are continually growing in the offsite industry. And if we could aim those resources at generating more projects through ownership and execution partnerships like those we have with our investors, we can ultimately create more reliable pipeline with an experienced group that's only doing volumetric, modular, and other offsite solutions to continue to grow that pipeline.
Well, I love that you're talking to those investors and that you are creating this understanding of investing. So new traditional investors that are coming in are excited, right? They hear about all of these technical things that come about with construction and with offsite solutions. Can you give us any examples of any of those conversations or what they're asking you on these calls?
You know, a lot of times what'll happen is because even if they are interested, what ultimately ends up they end up getting a very oversimplified sort of assumptions of what the industry has to offer, and they're not incorrect. It usually comes down to a certain schedule percentage gain or cost compression or other generalized metrics that the industry has experienced. Then they'll hear about the sort of binary success failures of enterprises. And unlike any other industry that I'm familiar with, it's never management, it's always the industry, which I find strange. And I don't know if that's just because of the sort of industry sector we're in. But ultimately, I end up having to or choose to separate limitations that are enterprise specific or industry specific. And it almost never ends up being something completely unnuanced, either for the benefit of my getting their business or on the positive end. So ultimately, something like schedule gain, right? An investor might say, well, we've heard that, and it's wonderful that you're championing offsite solutions. We've heard that immediately, just by signing up, we're going to get 30% off the schedule. To that, I try to back away from those sort of universal assumptions, because they're certainly not accurate. Whether they pencil or we exceed them has to do ultimately on a project base or a project specific case by case. So all I'll tell them is that, okay, well, there's this certain regulatory benefit that you may have heard that, you know, the vertical aspect of the project is going to go through a state approval process. And the relationships are such that it's more streamlined for these reasons, more effective for the factory in these reasons. And we typically lose a month here traditionally, or 2 months onboarding subs traditionally, or plan check might take us 90 days. And in this case, it'll be 2 45-day rounds running in parallel. And then I can tell you, here's our project schedule. Feel free to, evaluate it from a traditional sense. And so that's how I sort of try to take a step back from those sort of marketing bylines and turn it into actionable information that will specifically be called out for in our pro forma. So that's one example, and then cost compression is another, and there's a bunch of nuanced ways to sort of approach this.
Yeah, but I like it because I think what you're doing is speaking the truth, right? There's all these exaggerations and things that are going on in the industry, like any industry. And I always think, we've been at so many conferences, and there are those factories that aren't doing well, or the ones that are, or the ones that have gone out of business, or the projects that are really wonderful, or the projects that fail. But the thing is, like you said, I think the most wonderful thing that you said is that they're blaming the industry instead of the management specific to that project. And so understanding the management and being clear, and I think your communication at what you have experienced and what you have seen and what you have measured has to go a long way with that individual that's speaking with you and wanting to know the process, right?
Right. Well, what we've noticed is that there is no space for compromise on the workflow of the business, or on a I don't know if I want to call it upskilling or uptraining of every individual in our firm that touches product digitally or physically, understanding the offsite solution. And so, we don't just recruit superintendents and PMs from offsite. We recruit them from the industry at large, and then ultimately just train them up. Not to say it's a barrier, unlearnable, or any sort of challenge, but there is a certain level of urgency when you're in fabrication, nuances of plan check that ultimately come back to constructability, and all of those are the responsibility of the owner to have a team that's there shouldn't almost be a need for the fabricator to pick up the slack of decision-making challenges or friction at ownership. And so we noticed that there was no way to do 2 projects in the traditional fashion and then 2 projects using offsite. We had to commit the whole team to one process, one methodology, one standard of execution, and not compromise from that element. And it became, I think, maturing into that negotiation ultimately with investors say, look, I'm not here to represent the industry. I'm representing our competence as developers. But I'll be very clear that there's no compromise on how we execute because we've committed to it for our own business. We want to do more projects, put more capital to work at scale with less friction. And we're not willing to go and hire 4 new positions because you want to do it stud by stud. And so once that's communicated, and then there's sort of a middle where there's a voice of reason and saying you may have heard these things, positive and negative, and I'll tell you why both of them are not applicable to this discussion. And once we cut through that, then it's smooth sailing.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. Not everybody can do that or taking the time to understand that. So leveraging that, and, I understand the investment world, and it can be a little tricky and a little bit, difficult. And then you being the executor for the development, the communication process is such a big deal. And having a supportive team of investors that not only can see what you're doing and you're communicating it, but you're executing it. In your opinion, there seems to be this captive audience that these investors are looking at leveraging industrialized construction on a global and a regional level. What has been your experience on that?
Right. So there's both, from my understanding, the studies I've seen, I spend a lot of time building projects, so it's the exposure that I choose to have. But ultimately, there's a growth of investment in both the enterprises related to industrialized construction, the technology related to it, simultaneous to the actual projects. And just like there's not much of an emphasis on quality management being either the problem or the benefit, there's also, but there is an ultimate idea that this ecosystem of businesses using a better process to execute on projects ultimately needs projects to work on. And so we've, as just a developer that ultimately is continuing to absorb growth opportunity, we'll say, okay, if we see a technology out in the market, we say that's a pre-con tool, let's go ahead and grab that and partner with them. this fabricator has a certain level of enterprise investment, we probably want to talk to them and see what is it, how they earned that, right? Ultimately, it's probably because their business has a certain level of due diligence on it. And same with us. So ultimately, we want to take that same captive audience, those investors that are active in that market, because the same investors that are backing fabricators probably ultimately want them to deliver modules, right? Or other offsite assemblies. So as oriented as we can be towards capturing new investors that are just seeking better returns and more predictable outcomes, we're also recultivating those same investors that are active in our industry for that mutual benefit.
So where are these investors coming from? The fabricators? Are they seeing your product? How are they finding you, Anthony? How do they come to your table and be like, well, we're working with we really love technology and we want to start investing more in it? Or how are they presenting themselves? Because in my discovery with offsite investors or construction investors, it's a very unique and a very specific audience. I noticed that out of the 2023, I think there was a top 20 investment firms. Each one of them had a small segment that they were investing in green technology and building technology. So it's on the forefront of these large investment firms. But then again, it's never really that easy to find these individuals that want to be involved in it.
We've been developing interest just as any other traditional developer would, and it's usually through capital groups and those relationships, capital brokers, other sort of due diligence experts, BDCs or whatever they might be, or fund managers. I personally see that opportunity, and occasionally it's overlapped where we know of a group that's backed a fabricator or made a purchase within the industry somewhere in the supply chain, even if they were involved in a strategic with another big corporate for a materials line to supply the modular industry. We're like, okay, well, this investor group obviously is aware of the opportunity from a vendor perspective. Do they have a real estate investment arm? Are they affiliated with other groups that invest directly in projects? And then we'll pursue that. It seems fairly obvious that there would be more overlap in those, and maybe it's maybe there's a need for industry partners to understand the benefit of sort of recycling those contacts for it to really materialize. But I think that that's one of the strongest elements of the business.
I love that
of the approach.
And
so
I think
we'll see.
And I think it's a smart way to find those investors, because they're already part of the industry, right? They already understand and they believe in it, and they're moving forward. It's kind of like any industry. If you are in software development, then you're looking for that industry, right? And this is I feel like we're on the cusp of great expansion. It's like we're just starting to really kind of formulate that. So I think it's brilliant that your firm has realized to kind of get into that industry. It's kind of funny, when I started 6 years ago at Modular Shoreside, my own company, and just doing modular homes and doing the general contracting work for that, I came to Advancing Prefab, which we met there last year. And I thought, oh my God, I've arrived, because the 1,200 people that are here already love offsite or some kind of multi-trade, or they like something in the industry. It's like, oh my God, there's people here that are just like me. It was so exciting to see that. So it's nice to see that you've also thought, hey, why are we not working in this segment? This is it's like low hanging fruit, right?
Of course. And and the same feeling came to me too when you're at Advancing Prefabrication, and not every company's name ends in modular or ends in a very specific trade element. You have diversified, global technology companies. You have contracting firms that are, have their own investment arms. You have a lot of opportunity there. And I think at that point, it just becomes a communication challenge to get to the right people, but you're already within the right industry. And then at some point, you have less and less friction as those discussions go on. And ultimately, that's what we've experienced, and the momentum we have ultimately became a direct factor of our traction and completed successful projects. And self bankrolling up to that point. And now that we have a 100-unit project, 125-unit project, we can promise a level of scale that's attractive to institutional or enterprise backers, and that's really where it comes to.
So a lot of the people may not know this, but you're building in California, which seems to be very accepting of using offsite solutions. Also, there is such magnitude needed in that area. I mean, from affordable housing to really any type of building structure or building opportunity. It is just a mammoth market that needs so much. It has such a big demand. When we're looking at the demand and we're talking about these fabricators and their pipeline of projects, how does it work being the investor or the developer to kind of support them and to commit to this process? Has that been an easy process for you, or how is that trending? How is that moving?
So we realized early on that we have to build a business around our specific approach to the market. And it started with the thesis, the partners focused on the regulatory advantages coming from City Hall, and I say City Hall, but coming from government in general, and seeing the regulatory advantage of getting your plan checks run in parallel. I came at it from a constructability side, realizing that scale was the only way to really get the cost compression at a large scale, and ultimately negotiating with other solvent and established vendors versus a sort of decentralized ecosystem that you have just inherent to construction. But ultimately, around that knowledge, you have to build, as an owner, the processes to get the answers to everyone in a timely way, in a timely fashion. Your reporting, everything ultimately has to be cohesive enough that you can really get the predictability benefit from offsite construction. And so it's always fascinating to see, and it's wonderful if developers, it's the first time they're going to produce a project using offsite, or they're approaching that course, or bigger companies are moving bigger gears to put entire teams on something. The success rate is going to correlate directly to how baked in it is into the process of those individuals taking over that project. And so for us, it becomes a question of not just repeatability being the key to success at fabrication, but it's repeatability is the key to success of the actual enterprise itself, coordinating these projects. So we have to create something and a methodology internally to deliver regular results or continuous results on a given set of projects. And so that's where all of the investment ultimately goes, is to the people and getting them trained up specific to what works best in contracting factories and horizontal construction.
Absolutely. And the great thing that you're also touching on, when I look at it from the investor perspective, if you've got a product, a process, and you can duplicate that, and you're hitting those timelines, how can they not just love it and be happy, right? And at the end of the day, if everybody is happy, then everybody's going to want to prosper and work together. So jumping into, engineering the narrative of 30% faster, and people having these kind of, I guess, thought process in their head, how this all works. When you look from project to project and you're looking at R&D and regulatory advantages, cost compression across trades, overall, how is this changing? How is it evolving in your business model?
So for us, the first stages were make sure the team was competent, all the way from the superintendent through PM, director of development, all the way through. We want to streamline sense of communication. Once we have that sort of basis, then we were looking at the acquisition stage, how do we underwrite for modular? So it became a question of leveraging some technology in the space to do our massings with specific elements that we've used in the past. The data that we got from the fabricators to feed into our early pre-pro forma, to when we got sort of objections from investment on, okay, what does it mean financially to advance more to the fabricator, or use more equity in the front, or additional costs of insurance versus the efficiencies you're getting with cost and schedule compression. we wanted to itemize that down to the last penny, so to speak, in our financial projections. That was the sort of first element of growth. And then the second now is we'll study as ownership, again, as the group that ultimately contracts the factories again and again. We now get to an engineering grade sort of due diligence that comes down to the components, the costs, assemblies that create more efficiencies for our fabricator that we incorporate in our design independent of them. And then when we start the discussion with them, we do it at a point in time when it's reasonable. So that is a very far reach away from telling investors, because it's built in this way, we're 30% faster or 10% below market. We can speak to the results that we've had, and we have trimmed months off the project schedules, but for very specific reasons. And so we'll highlight those instead. And when we get cost per compression, they'll first say, oh, it must be because it's modular. Well, no, it's because we gave 250,000 square feet to a super sub and negotiated a good price and locked it in for future projects. There's sometimes it's wonderful that that's what makes it to the investor side. Usually it's two extremes. It'll be really short positive blips and then really short negative summations of other projects. And so both of those are inaccurate. And so we just try to come from a place of nuance, but then focus on past results of our enterprise specifically. And I'd love to champion the industry always, but those LP conversations are usually asking about the industry when they're really saying, what is it that you're actually offering? And so the conversation really has nothing to do with the performance of companies that have gone under or other reasons, because that's not relevant to the project at hand. And so we just try to drill down very specifically on risk management or risk aversion, specific parallels and timelines or benefits to the schedule, and anything else that's tangible and provable early in the process. And the rest, they kind of have to wait for it to pan out. But we try to focus on those items specifically.
It's data and it's measurement and it's communication. And obviously you're achieving all of those. And that is also a return on your investment and a return on those relationships. Cross section with Anthony Gude. It's been a wonderful discussion on the industry, on investors, on the finances, and how we're seeing the trend from the investor to the end product and the data in between. Thank you, Anthony, for being here on Offsite Dirt. It's a wonderful experience to know that you have done the work, you are continuing to grow in this industry, and you have the measurable results to talk about it. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Audrey.